Hello everyone, we're on chapter 9 and we're on paragraph 8. So let's get started. The characterological disposition is formed by the more or less permanent content of our subjective life, that is, by the content of our mental pictures and feelings. Whether a mental picture which enters my mind at this moment stimulates me to an active will or not depends on how it relates itself to the content of all my other mental pictures and also to my idiosyncrasies of feeling. But after all, the general content of my mental pictures is itself conditioned by the sum total of those concepts which have, in the course of my individual life, come into contact with percepts, that is, have become mental pictures. This sum, again, depends on my greater or lesser capacity for intuition and on the range of my observations, that is, on the subjective and objective factors of experience, on my inner nature and situation in life. My characterological disposition is determined especially by my life of feeling. Whether I shall make a particular mental picture or concept into a motive of action or not will depend on whether it gives me joy or pain. These are the elements which we have to consider in an active will. The immediately present mental picture or concept, which becomes the motive, determines the aim or the purpose of my will. My characterological disposition determines me to direct my activity towards this aim. The mental picture of taking a walk in the next half hour determines the aim of my action. But this mental picture is raised to the level of a motive for my will only if it meets with a suitable characterological disposition. That is, if during my past life I have formed the mental pictures of the sense and purpose of taking a walk, of the value of health, and further, if the mental picture of taking a walk is accompanied in me by a feeling of pleasure. Paragraph 8 is summarized as follows. The characterological disposition is formed by the content of our subjective life, that is, by the content of our mental pictures and feelings. An active will can be influenced by how a mental picture relates to my other mental pictures and is influenced by my life of feeling. My capacity for intuition and my range of observations are other factors that influence my will. So this paragraph, Steiner is talking about how our characterological disposition or our personal individual makeup is formed by the content of our subjective life, which is the content of our mental pictures and feelings. And because mental pictures and feelings, as Steiner has already talked about, are subjective. So that is what our personality is formed by, these mental pictures and feelings. And when we get a mental picture, it can stimulate us to an active will. It depends on how it relates to other mental pictures that we have acquired in life. And it also relates to our feelings. And again, our feelings are based on what we have gone through in our life. And that's what he's pointing out in this paragraph. And again, he says the mental pictures that we acquire is influenced by our capacity for intuition and the range of observations that we have gathered in our life. Because some of us obviously have a more greater capacity for intuition, some of us have more observations we've made, because, what did I have here? Our range of influence, our range of observation is influenced by where we are in our life, geographically and whatnot. So, if I travel a lot, my observations are a little different than someone that just stays in the same city their entire life. So that and our capacity for intuition are other factors which influence our will. And my notes here. So he's just basically talking about in this paragraph what influences our will. The immediately present mental pictures that become motive, that influences our will, our life of feeling, other mental pictures that we have gathered during life. Our characterological disposition determines whether I carry this aim out or not. Steiner uses the example in the second half of the paragraph of going for a walk. So the more mental pictures somebody has, which is as a result of their capacity for intuition, the more mental pictures somebody has, the more it can influence whether they decide to go for a walk. So here he says somebody can, think of the purpose of going for a walk, how good it is for you, or it might make you feel good. So they have all these mental pictures that influence their act of will, and that is what determines whether they carry out this aim or not. And also, too, many people have a negative mental picture, and that may spur them to action or inaction as well. So that is what he's talking about in this paragraph. So this paragraph just basically talks about the elements that we have to consider in an act of will. In chapter 9, he does talk a lot about the will, because we do have to understand the will and what role it plays in freedom, because again, this book is about freedom and the philosophy behind it. And so that's what he's pointing out in this paragraph. So I'm going to move on to 9. We must therefore distinguish 1. The possible subjective dispositions which are capable of turning certain mental pictures and concepts into motives, and 2. The possible mental pictures and concepts which are in a position to influence my characterological disposition so that an act of will results. For our moral life, the former represents the driving force, and the latter its aim. And paragraph 9 is summarized as follows. We must distinguish between 1. The driving force, which is the possible subjective dispositions which can turn certain mental pictures and concepts into motive, and 2. The aims, which are the possible mental pictures and concepts which are in a position to influence my characterological disposition so that an act of will results. This is a very important paragraph, because in those previous paragraphs he's talking about driving force and motive, and he's continuing to distinguish what is a driving force and motive. Okay, so in number 1 he's talking about driving force, which is the possible subjective dispositions which are capable of turning certain mental pictures and concepts into motives. And what I think is interesting about that distinction is he's pointing out that we can now turn what is the driving force, which is we're operating at an unfree level, which is something very instinctual. He's pointing out that that it's capable of turning certain mental pictures and concepts into motives. So if you're operating at that instinctual level, you can gather the mental pictures and the concepts so that you can turn it into a motive, which is a conscious act. And so the driving force is now, he's pointing out this possibility that we have with when we're operating at an instinctual level, that we can turn it and become conscious of things. So I think that's a very important point in his whole philosophy, because he's distinguishing that. Many people may say, well, instinctual that's it. No, but for Steiner, he's pointing out that we have this capacity for acquiring mental pictures and concepts and turning them into motives. So that's an important point in that paragraph. The motives is known as the aims, and an aim is basically a motive that successfully influenced our characterological disposition and resulted in an act of will. So that's what he's also clarifying, what happens when you have a conscious motive, and then what work it produces, that is called the aim. So that's what he's distinguishing here. That's all we're going to cover for today, but it's going to get much more interesting when he further continues discussing this. So keep summarizing your paragraphs, and have a good day. Bye.